Hello, my name's Roisin and it's August, which means it is Women in Translation Month, and so I thought I would recommend you some books by women in translation which I love. However, I was trying to make this 10 because I normally talk about 10 books I love, and I couldn't seem to find 10 books by women in translation that I have read and also loved. So I'm clearly not reading enough books by women in translation. So I thought I would talk to you about the books that I've loved and then also my TBR, what I'm planning to read this month as well. And the first one on my list is Katalin Street by Magda, Szabo, which I read a couple of years ago during August. This was translated from the Hungarian by Enriquez. It is set in Budapest in the Second World War, about 3 families who live in 3 houses next to one another. And the children of these houses get to become friends, and there are holes in their fences so they can run and play between the 3 houses. It is also set later on during whilst Hungary is part of the Soviet bloc, and something terrible has happened during the war that means these families have broken apart, and one is living in Greece and they are no longer connected as they were. And it follows the experience of Hungary during the war, of being invaded by the Nazis. One of the families of these 3 families is a Jewish family, and the effect that that has on them. And then we also have during the Soviet era and the effect of being watched by the secret police and what might really be going on. There is also a ghost. The ghost of one of the children is haunting everyone in the Soviet era, and it is through her eyes that we see the entire story. This is so haunting, which is pun not intended, but it is a brilliantly written book that is still and slow and sad, but with a lot of power to it as well. There is a lot of discussion of music and culture and freedom and what it means to be free, and also of the rise of authoritarianism and of the ways that people try to help one another, also the repercussions of that, how things can go further than they thought, and the ways that the haunting of the past, the ways that things can stay with you. I love any book with ghosts. That's not true, but I love literary books with ghosts. I think there is something so wonderful about the way that they can talk about grief, loss, the past, and the things that people fixate on, and I think it was done wonderfully well in this book. The next is Pink Slime by Fernanda Trias, which was translated from the Spanish by Cleary, and it also won the Uruguayan Prize for Fiction, I think. Something that's probably not the correct title, but it is from a Uruguayan author and it won their top literature prize. And this is a post-apocalyptic novel, which is not something I usually enjoy, but I really enjoyed it this time. It is set in a small coastal town when this sort of mutant algae has arrived. It has dyed the entire river red, it has killed all of the fish, and all of the birds have also disappeared, and with it there comes a fog and a wind which bring with it illnesses, and so people are being quarantined, and also that people are not able to see people in the hospital, people are not coming out. It is a very still, slow moving book about this specific woman whose ex-husband is in the hospital. Her mother also lives slightly more inland in a house of very rich people. She also looks after a young boy whose rich family have left him because he has a condition that means that he is always hungry and always eating, and including sometimes his own hand. And it is a dark, strange little book, but one I really enjoy, because as I said, I don't normally enjoy post-apocalyptic fiction, but I think the smallness of this book, its focus on this one particular woman and her apathy towards what's going on in her life, her feeling stuck and contained, but also her own lack of impetus to do anything. There is a definite feeling of depression and mental health hovering over it, and of course a feeling of the pandemic as well with lockdowns. It is so wonderfully written, and so there are all these interjections of discussions that she had, well, it presumed are discussions between her and her husband, who was always questioning her, questioning language, and questioning what we understand and what we know, and I think it has that feeling of being tired, of being completely drained, and I think it was very powerfully evoked. Then we have Stillborn by Guadalupe Nettel, which was translated from the Spanish by Rosalind Harvey, and this one is set in Mexico. It is about a woman called Elena, who her and her best friend Laura decide when they're in their 20s that they don't want to have children, and then when they are in their 30s, Elena breaks up with her boyfriend because of that, and Laura decides that she does want children after all. Elena also has a difficult relationship with her own mother, and when Laura gets pregnant, Laura is told that they don't think that that baby will be viable, will survive very long after outside of the womb. We see all this from at Alina's perspective, her perspective on mothering, of being mothered by her own mother, and of her relationship with this person who has now become a mother, the becoming, what that means to become a position, that an idea, and how that changes you, and also how that changes depending on when something like having this severe disability and this being told that you are going to become a mother and then lose your child as soon as that happens. And so it is a very still, slow moving novel that is very much focused inside the mind of Alina and inside the inner turmoil and emotions of what is going on. It is written in quite a distanced style as well, but I think it really worked for the subject matter. There, it allowed space for you as a reader to fill in the gaps and to ruminate. There was a lot of space and time for thinking when reading this book, and I really enjoyed that about it, and allows space for the full range of emotions that both of our characters feel. The sense of loss and rage and selfishness and acceptance, and how you give and how you sustain relationships once something like this has happened, something so all-consuming that it takes over your life. One that I've talked about a lot is The Vegetarian by Kang, which was translated from the Korean by Deborah Smith. This one is set in South Korea about a woman who has a dream which causes her to decide to become a vegetarian, which is unusual in Korea. Her family really do not want her to go through with this, and it is seen as her being completely off the rails, and so her family try to forcibly stop it, particularly her husband and her father, and it is an exploration therefore of the patriarchal culture in which she is living and the ways that people think they can control her, the ways that she is trapped and cannot escape her confines, and the way that this small rebellion is seen as such a huge deal. And it is told from the perspective of three different voices, that of her husband, who is so annoying and so difficult to read from, but then also from her brother-in-law, and then from her sister. And there is a othering of her other nature, and the way that sexualization by men plays into this othering of women, this distance from them. She is almost an inanimate object, this disconnect from what it means to be a woman and womanhood, and from sexuality, and her disconnecting from social mores, what is allowed, what is acceptable, and becoming unmoored from that, but we never see anything from her perspective, and so we are always being mediated through the perspective of others. There's a lot of really beautiful descriptive language that is at the same time distanced, and I really enjoyed that. I think that it is a book that really captured my mind and made me feel super absorbed. It's a very short book, and one that I found very difficult to put down. Once I got past that first section I thought I was not going to like this book, and then when it changed voices it became obvious how much that was just due to the voice in which I was reading the first part, and I thought that was very powerful. The way that she was able to change voices so easily, the way that things became melancholy or dark or aggressive or obsessive, depending on which voice we were listening in from, and I really thought it was so well done. Another thought-provoking short book is Mona by Pola Oloixarac. This was translated from the Spanish by Adam Morris, and is about a woman who is a writer from Peru who is travelling to a literary convention in a Scandinavian place, I can't remember which one, and she seems like she's trying to escape something. She's trying to escape her presence in Peru, but also her own body, her own self, and there is a lot of abuse of drugs and keeping herself in a state so that she does not enter into herself. She is completely unmindful, and she arrives at this place, and there are writers from all over the world who have been nominated for this award, and all of them are kind of representations of stereotypes of their place in the world, and they kind of play into that or play against that as we go on. It's a very strange place that they have landed in, where there is things going on that don't quite make sense, and the things that they are told by the organisers don't quite line up with what is going on, and there is a sense of foreboding and danger, and all of these writers judging one another. It's a kind of a satire of literary circles and the expectations of writers based on where they're from. As I said, there is this French guy who is just the embodiment of ennui, and it is a funny book in that sense, but there is also something darker going on. We can feel from Mona there is something she is avoiding, something she is not saying, and bits of it slip in through the sides. It builds up and up until it becomes and there's this real feeling of tension and this real need for a release, and I think that is done very well. It is wry and humorous, and at the same time incredibly uncomfortable and difficult, and I think that it manages to balance those things. It manages to balance those things so skillfully. A collection of short stories in translation that I loved is Things We Lost in the Fire by Mariana Enriquez, which has translated again from the Spanish, lots of these from the Spanish. This was translated by McDowell, and this is a collection of short stories, horror short stories, that are are on the more unsettling end than on the kind of slashery end. They are strange little weird stories set in Argentina, which is where Mariana Enriquez is from, and they are books that definitely have the hangover of the dictatorship that happened in Argentina in the 70s, and also of the violence that still exists in Buenos Aires. Most of these are set in Buenos Aires, and it has ghosts and strange creatures and people committing like crimes that have happened in the past, and it has that very magical realist thing of the violence that is true to life alongside this magic. The violence is real, so if the violence is real, why is the unsettling and wonderfully so? I really enjoyed this. If you are into horror at all, I think these short stories would be for you, and they are so wonderfully written and so unsettling and creepy, and I find it hard to find books that make me feel that sense of discomfort that I really want from a creepy dark horror book. I feel a lot of them, they don't go there, and they don't feel ominous enough, and they don't feel, but at the same time they either feel too predictable or the camera died and now I can't remember where I was. But the last book I wanted to talk to you about was Kim Jiyoung, born 1982, by Chonamji. This is another book set in Korea and another very short book. It is about a woman who at the beginning has a mental breakdown, and then we flash back into her life and we discover how she has grown up and everything she has lived through that has led up to this point, from school to her family to the workplace to her marriage, all the ways in which she has been broken down just because she is a woman. Her experience of growing up in a patriarchal culture that didn't take her seriously in terms of academics, and then didn't take her seriously when she complained about abuse, and the small and large ways in which she was broken down and beaten down, and eventually made to leave her job and to stay at home, which was not something that she wanted herself. It was just something that she felt compelled to do by culture. It's a book written in a really interesting way, quite a detached style, and there are also footnotes throughout it which reference studies that talk about the things that she has experienced and how common they are for South Korean women. And so it's a really interesting style, and I also really enjoyed the ending. I thought it was very powerful and very well done. It explored the sort of ingrainedness of this and the difficulty of breaking free in a culture when the whole culture is situated around a certain way of being. It has a lot of reflected for experiences of patriarchy in other parts of the world, but it is also very, very specific to the South Korean context, and so it works on both of those levels. And it was a book that really hit me when I read it. I found it a very powerful read, so I definitely think it's one worth considering if you haven't read it already. So those are the 8 books that I recommend, and then I said I was going to talk to you about some of the books on my TBR as well. One of those is the Aeneid, which of course was written by Virgil, who was not a woman, but the translation I specifically have somewhere, I can't find it right now, is by Shadi Barscht, who is a female classics scholar, and I really enjoyed reading Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey, and so I wanted to try and read a translation of the Aeneid as well, to read a more modern translation. I think when I was at uni, that I was reading the like Oxford classics, the like black cover with a picture of something from the British Museum on the front, that you get as the kind of standard translation. I did a classics degree, so I did my dissertation on interactions between Ovid's Metamorphoses and Virgil's Aeneid. So I had a specific translation I was using, but I can't remember the name of the translator 10 years later. But yeah, so I wanted to try and read a new translator and to really think about translation as an art form. And so I think that even though it's not a woman in translation, it is a woman doing translation. So I think that it fits with the like feeling, the vibe of Women in Translation Month. I also want to read My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante, the start of the Neapolitan series, which is a series about 2 young women from Naples in the 20th century, growing up in poverty and like talking about basically the Italian history of the Italian 20th century, middle to late 20th century, and these two, this strong female friendship, and it's a lot of drama involved as well. Everybody's talked about how much they love it, and I'm going to Florence in October, and I think the 3rd book is set there, so I kind of want to read the first one in August and the second one in September, so that I'm prepped to read the 3rd one by the time I go to Florence myself. I also want to read Drive Your Plough Over the Bones of the Dead by Olga Tcharkok, which is about someone who is translating the poetry of William Blake, I believe, and it's got some like mythical elements too. It's a book that I've heard so many people talk about, well, alongside the Book of Jacob, which I think is her book that is like enormously huge, so I want to read this one in August because it's a little shorter. I also want to read Agua Viva by Clarice Lispector. I've heard so many people talking about Lispector this year on BookTube and also on Bookstagram, and I've never read her. She's a Ukrainian Brazilian writer, so it's translated from Portuguese, and yeah, I've never read any of her work before, so I want to try that. Then we also have Kitchen by Manana Yoshimoto, which is one that I have seen, again, people talking about on Instagram, and that's what's made me intrigued to read it. It's supposed to be very emotional, but also quite short, I believe it's quite short, so I'm looking forward to adding that. And then on NetGalley, I have 2 books in translation. I have Lost on Me by Veronica Ramo, which was translated, can't see the translator, but this is an Italian bestseller about a girl who grew up in Rome with an omnipresent mother who's devoted to her own anxiety, and a father ruled, can you just hear that grating? I apologise. A father ruled by hygienic and architectural obsessions, and a precocious genius brother at the centre of attention. It's supposed to be really funny, so I'm looking forward to reading a funny book. And then I also have Wound by Oksana Vasyakina, and both of these come out in early September, so I'm probably going to try and read them as soon as possible. A woman who's a young queer poet who decides to return to her mother's ashes to their working class home in Serbia after her death from breast cancer. A journey home will take her through the raw, dreamlike emotions of early grief to acceptance of the wound it leaves behind. And it was translated from Russian by Alina Alta. So those are the ones that I am hoping to get to this month. Obviously, that's quite a few, so we'll see how many I actually manage to get to. But if you've read any of them, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. And let me know what you're reading this Women in Translation month. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.